Hi, just wanted to let you know that I'm back to reading Harry Potter. We're going to be doing chapter 6 today. And I know I've been really bad about adding post it notes, and I've actually taken a few of mine out, but I haven't been doing my job. So today, we really need to write down some post it notes, some things that are definitely strange or we don't know what it means, or something that you might want to share with your book club, because I know that they want you to share with your book club again. Okay. Um, so this is chapter 5. I think I said chapter 6, but we're actually on chapter 5. And it's the Whooping Willow. Not necessarily the Weeping Willow, which is what we have here in Wisconsin, in Menominee Falls, and actually the United States, we have the weeping willows, but this is actually the whooping willows. Okay. The end of the summer vacation came too quickly for Harry's liking. He was looking forward to getting back to Hogwarts, but his month at the Barrows had been the happiest of his life. It was different. Not it was different not to feel jealous of Ron when he thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome he expected next time he turned up on Peavy Privet Drive. On their last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a suspicious dinner that included all of Harry's favorite things, ending with a mouth-watering treacle pudding. Treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of filibuster fireworks. They filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to wall at, for, for at least half an hour. Then it was time for the last mug of hot cocoa and bed. That's one of the notes I'm going to write down. Actually, I'm going to put two notes down on here. The first one is treacle pudding. I have no idea what treacle pudding is. I should look that one up. And then the other one is the filibuster fireworks. I think I would have loved to seen that. So, and what is the meaning of filibuster? Okay, so that's two things that I'm going to post there. Okay. It was a long while to get started. It took a long while to get started the next morning. They were up at dawn, but somehow they still seemed to have a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding in the stairs, half dressed with bits of toast in their hands, and Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck tripping over a stray chicken as he crossed the yard carrying Gina's trunk to the car. Harry could see how 8 people, 6 large trunks, 2 owls, and a rat were going to fit into the small Ford Angela. He had reckoned, of course, without the special features that Mr. Weasley had added. Not a word to Molly, he whispered to Harry as he opened the trunk and showed him how it had been magically expanded so that the luggage fit easily. When at last they were all in the car, Mrs. Weasley glanced into the back seat, where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side, and said, "Muggles do know more than they give them credit for, don't they?" She and Jenny got into the front seat, which had been stretched so that it resembled a park bench. I mean, you'd never know it was this roomy from the outside, would you?" Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they uh, tuck, trickled out of the yard. Harry turned back for one last look at the house. He barely had time to wonder when he'd see it again. When they were back, George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run in for his broomstick. They had almost reached the highway when Ginny shrieked that she had left her diary. By the time they had clambered back into the car, they were running very late and tempers were running high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. "Molly, dear, no, Arthur. No one would see this little button here is an invisibility booster I installed that got us up in the air. Then we fly above the clouds. We'll be there in 10 minutes, and no one would be any wiser." I said no, Arthur, not in broad daylight. They reached King's Crossing at 11:15. Mr. Weasley dashed across the road to get the trolleys for their trunks, and they were all hurried into the station. Harry had brought the Hogwarts Express the previous year. The tricky part was getting onto the platform 9 3/4, wasn't which wasn't visible to the Muggle's eye. What he had to do was walk through the solid barrier dividing the platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully so that none of the Muggles noticed you vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed that they only had 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy strode briskly forward and vanished. Mr. Weasley went next. Fred and George followed. "I'll take Jenny, and you two come right after us," said Mrs. Weasley, told Harry and Ron. Grabbing Jenny's hand and starting off, in a blink of an eye, they were gone. "Let's go together. We're only got a minute," Ron said to Harry. Harry made sure that Hedgeworth's cage was safely um, wedged on top of the trunks and wheeled his trolley around to face the barrier. He felt perfectly confident. This wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using the flow powder. Both of them bent low over the handles of their trolleys and walked purposely towards the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet away, and they broke into a run and crash. Both trolleys hit the barrier and bounced backwards. Ron's trunk fell off with a loud thud. Harry was knocked off his feet, and Hedgeworth's cage bounced onto the shiny floor, and she rolled away, shrieking. People all around them stared and a guard yelled, "What in blazes you think you're doing?" "Lost control of the trolley," Harry grasped, clenching his ribs as he got up. Ron ran to pick up Hedgewood, who was causing such a scene that there was a lot of muttering about cruelty to animals from a surrounding crowd. "Why can't we get through?" Harry hissed to Ron. "I don't know." Ron looked wildly around. A dozen curious people were still watching them. "We're going to miss the train," Ron whispered. "I don't understand why the gateway sealed itself." Harry looked up at the giant clock with a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. He wheeled his trolley forward casually until it was right against the barrier and pushed with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. "It's gone," said Ron, sounding stunned. "The train left. What if Mom and Dad couldn't get back through to us?" Have you got any muggle money? Harry gave a hollow laugh. The Darsleys hadn't given me pocket money for about 6 years. Ron pressed his ear to the cold barrier. Can't hear a thing, he said tensely. What are we going to do? I don't know how long it'll take Mom and Dad to get back to us. They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because Hedwig's continued to shriek. I think we'd better go and wait by the car, said Harry. We're attracting too much attention. Harry, Ron said, his eyes gleaming. The car. What about it? We can fly the car to Hogsworth. But I thought, we're stuck, right? And we've got to get to school, haven't we? And even underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's really emergency. Section 19 or something of the restraints of uh, thingy. But your mom and dad, said Harry, pushing against the barrier again in the vain hope that it would give away. How will they get home? They don't need the car, said Ron impatiently. They know how to appropriate. You know, just vanish and reappear at home. They only bother with flow powder and the car because we're all underage and they're not allowed to uh, re- re- operate yet. Harry, feeling a panic, turned suddenly to excitement. Can you fly it? No problem, said Ron, wheeling the trolley around to face the exit. Come on, let's go. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hedgeworth Express. Boy, am I having trouble today. Then they marched off through the crowd of curious Mongols, out of the station and back onto the side road where they found the old Ford Angela was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous trunk with a series of taps from his wand. They heaved their luggage back in, put Hedgeworth in the back seat, and got into the front. Check that no one's watching, said Ron. Starting the engine with another tap of his wand, Ron stuck his head out of the window. Traffic was rumbling along the main roads ahead, but their street was empty. Okay, he said. Ron pressed the tiny silver button on the dashboard. The car turned, the car around them vanished, and so did they. They could feel the seats vibrating beneath him, hear the engine, feel his hands on his knees, and his glasses are on his nose. But for all he could see, he had become a pair of eyeballs floating a few feet above the ground in a dingy street full of parked cars. Let's go, said Ron's voice from his right, and the ground and the dirty buildings on either side fell away, dropping out of sight as the car rose. In seconds, the whole London lay smoky and glittering below them. There was a popping noise in the car. Harry and Ron reappeared. Oh, huh, said Ron, jabbing at the invisibility booster. It's faulty. Both of them plumbered it. The car vanished, then it flickered back again. Hold on, Ron yelled as he slammed his foot on the accelerator. They shot straight into the low, woolly clouds, and everything turned dull and foggy. Now what? Said Harry, blinking at the solid mass of cloud pressing in on them from all sides. We need to see the train to know what direction to go in, said Ron. Dip and dip back down again quickly. They dropped back beneath the clouds and twisted around in their seats, squinting at the ground. I can see it, Harry yelled. Right ahead, there. The Hogwarts Express was streaking along below them like a scarlet snake. Due north, said Ron, checking the compass on the dashboard. Okay, we'll just have to check on it every half hour or so. Hold on. And they shot through the clouds. A minute later, they burst into blazing sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the car skimmed the sea of fluffy clouds. The bright sky, endless blue under the blinking white sun. All they got, all we've got to worry about now are airplanes, said Ron. They looked at each other and started to laugh. For a long time, they couldn't stop. It was as though they had been plucked into a fabulous dream. This, though Ron was surely the only one to travel past swirls and turrets of snowy clouds in a car full of her bright sunlight, with hot, full of bright, full of hot, bright sunlight, with a fat pack of toffees in the glove compartments, and the prospect of seeing Fred and George's jealous faces as they landed smoothly and suspiciously on the sweeping lawns in front of Hogwarts Castle. They made regular checks on the train as they flew further and further north, each dip beneath the clouds showing them a different view. London was soon far behind them, replaced by neat green fields that gave way in turn to wide purplish moors. A giant city above, alive with cars like multicolored ants, villages with tiny toy churches. Several uneventful hours later, however, Harry had to admit that some of the fun was wearing off. The toffees had made them extremely thirsty, and they had nothing to drink. He and Ron had pulled off their sweaters, but Harry's t-shirt was sticking to the back of his seat, and his glasses kept sliding down the end of his sweaty nose. He had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now and was thinking longingly of the train miles below, where they could buy ice cold pumpkin juice from a trolley pushed by a plump witch. Why hadn't they been able to get onto the platform 9 3/4? Can't be much further, can it? Croaked Ron. Hours later still, as the sun started to sink into their floor of clouds, straining it a deep purple, staining it a deep purple, ready for another check on the train. It was still right below them, winding its way past a snow-capped mountain. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove upward again, but as he did, the engine began to whine. Harry and Ron exchanged nervous glances. It's probably just tired, said Ron. It's never been this far before. And they both pretended not to notice the whining growling louder and louder as the sky became steadily darker. Stars were blossoming in the darkness. Harry pulled his sweater back on, trying to ignore the way the windshield wipers had been waving feebly as though in protest. Not far, said Ron, more to the car than to Harry. Not far now, and he patted the dashboard nervously. When they fell back beneath the clouds a little while later, they had to squint through the darkness for the landmarks they knew. There, Harry shouted, making Ron and Hedgewood jump straight ahead. Silhouette of the dark horizon, High on the cliffs over the lake stood the many turrets and towers of Hogwarts Castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. Come on, Ron said, um, giving the steering wheel a little shake. Nearly there. Come on. The engine groaned. Nearly jets of steam were, were issuing from underneath the hood. Harry found himself gripping the edges of the seat very hard as they flew towards the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out of his window, Harry saw the smooth, black, glossy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The car wobbled again. Come on, Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron, put your feet down. Ron put his foot down. There was a loud clink and a sputter. The engine died completely. That's exciting, hey? It's hard to believe. I think I'm gonna write a little note there quickly because I could almost feel the excitement. I felt like I was right there with them. Okay, I don't think they're safe yet though. So let me continue to read. Okay. Oh, Ron said into the silence. The noise of the car dropped. They were falling, gathering speed ahead, straight from the solid castle, straight for the solid castle wall. No, Ron yelled, swinging the steering wheel around. They missed the dark stone wall by inches as the car turned in a great arc, soaring over the dark greenhouses, then the vegetable patch, and then over the black lawn, losing altitude all the time. Ron let go of the steering wheel completely and pulled his wand out of his back pocket. Stop! Stop! He yelled, whacking the dashboard and the windshield, but they were still plummeting and the ground flying up towards them. Watch out for the tree! Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but too late. Crack! With an ear splattering bang of metal on wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was bellowing from under the crumpled hood. Hedgewood was shrieking in terror. A golf ball sized lump was throbbing on Harry's head, where he had hit the windshield, and and to his right, Ron let out a low, despairing groan. "Are you okay?" Harry said um, urgently. "My wand," said Ron in a shrieked voice. "Look at my wand." It had snapped almost in two. The tip was dangling limply, held on by a few splinters. Harry opened his mouth to say he was sure they'd be able to mend it up at school, but he never got started. At that very moment, something hit his right side of the car with force of a charging bull, sending him launching sideways into Ron, just as an equally heavy blow hit the roof. What's happened? Ron gasped, and staring through the windshield, and Harry looked around just in time to see a branch as thick as a platoon slash into it. The tree they had hit was attacking them. Its trunks were bent almost doubled, and its gnawing boughs were plummeting every inch of the car it could reach. Ow! Said Ron as another twisted limb punched a long dent into the door. The windshield was now trembling under a hail of blows, like the knuckle like twigs at a branch as thick as a battering ram was pounding fiercely on the roof, which seemed to be carving. Run for it, Ron shouted, throwing his full weight against the door. But next second he had knocked backwards into Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. "We're done for," he moaned as the ceiling sagged, but suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine had restarted. "Reverse!" Harry yelled, and the car shot backwards. The tree was still trying to hit them, but they could hear its roots cracking, as it almost ripped itself up, lashing out at them as they sped off, um, out of reach. "That," panted Ron, "was close. Well done, car." The car, however, had reached the end of its tether. With two sharp cracks, the door flew open, and Ron felt his seat tip sideways. Next thing he knew, he was sprawled on the damp ground. Loud thuds told him that the car had rejected their luggage from the trunk. Hedwig's cage flew through the air and burst open. She rose out of it with an angry shriek and sped off to the castle without a backwards look. Then dented, scratched, and steaming, the car rumbled off into the darkness, its rear lights blazing angrily. "Come back!" Ron yelled after it, banishing the broken wand. "Dad'll kill me!" But the car disappeared from view with one last snort from its exhaust. "Can you believe our luck?" said Ron, um, miserably bending down. He picked up Scrabbles. "Of all the trees we would hit, it would have gotten one that hits back." He glanced over his shoulder at the ancient tree, which was still flailing its branches threateningly. "Come on back, come on," said Harry wearily. "We'd better go up to the school." It wasn't all that triumphant arrival that they pictured. Stiff, cold, and bruised, they seized the ends of their trunks and began dragging them up the grassy slope towards the great oak front doors. "I think the feast had already started," said Ron, dropping his trunks at the foot of the front steps and crossing quickly to look through the brightly lit windows. "Hey, Harry, come and look. It's it's sorting." Harry hurried over, and together he and Ron peered into the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in mid-air over the four long, crowded tables, making the golden plates and goblets sparkle. Overhead, the bewitching ceiling, which always mirrored the sky outside, sparkled with stars. Through the forest of pointed black Hogwarts hats, and Harry saw a long line of scared-looking first years filling into the hall. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Wesley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall had dispatched which a dispec, dis, a witch with her hair in a tight bun was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on a stool before the newcomers. Every year, this age-old hat, um, patched, frayed, and dirty, sorted new students into four Hogwarts houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Harry, well remembering putting it on exactly 1 year ago and waiting, petrified for its decision as it muttered aloud in his ear. For a few horrible seconds, he had feared that he would be going to be put in with the Slytherins, the house that had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other. But he had ended up in Gryffindor along with Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the Weasleys. Last term, Harry and Ron had helped Gryffindor win the house championship, beating the Slytherins for the first time in 7 years. A very small, mousy-haired boy had been called forward to place the hat on his head. Harry's eyes widened past him to where Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, was watching the sorting from the staff table. His long silver beard and half-moon glasses shining brightly in the candlelight. Several seats along, Harry saw uh, Gilderoy Lockwood dressed in robes of um, aquamarine, and there at the end of was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. "Hang on," Harry muttered to Ron. "There's an empty chair at the staff table. Where's Snape?" Professor Severus Snape was Harry's least favorite teacher. Harry also happened to be Snape's least favorite student. Cruel, sarcastic, and disliked by everyone except the students from his own house, Slytherin, Snape taught potions. "Maybe he's ill," said Ron hopefully. "Maybe he's left," said Harry, "because he missed out on the defense against the dark arts job again. Or he might have been sacked," said Ron enthusiastically. "I mean, everyone hates him." "Or maybe," said a very cold voice right behind them, "he's waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive on the school train." Harry sprung around. There, his black robes uh, whipping in the cold breeze, stood Snape. He was a thin man with sallow skin and a hooked nose and greasy shoulder-length black hair. And at this moment he was smiling in a way that told Harry he and Ron were in very deep trouble. "Follow me," said Snape. Not daring even to look at each other, Harry and Ron followed Snape up the stairs to the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches. A delicious smell of food was wafting around from the great hall, but Snape led them away for the warmth and the light, down a narrow stone staircase that led into the dungeons. "In," he said, opening a door halfway down the cold passageway and pointing. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars in which floated all manners of revolting things. Harry didn't really want to know the name of 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 the at the moment. The fireplaces were dark and empty. Snape closed the door and turned to look at them. "So," he said softly, "the train isn't good enough for the famous Harry Potter and his faithful sidekick Weasley? Wanted to arrive with a bang, did you boys?" "No, sir. It was the barrier at King's Crossing." "Silence!" said Snape coldly. "What have you done with the car?" Ron gulped. It wasn't the first time Snape had given Harry the impression of being able to read minds. But a moment later, he understood as Snape unrolled today's issue of the Evening Prophet. "You were seen," he hissed, showing them the headlines. "Flying Forward Angeli mystifies Muggles." He began to read aloud. "Two Muggles in London convinced they saw an old car flying over the post office tower at noon in Newfork. Miss Mrs. Harry Blayless, while hanging out her wash, Mr. Angus Fleet of Pebbles reported to the police 6 or 7 Muggles in all. I believe your father works for the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, he said, looking at Ron and smiling still more nastily. Dear, dear, his own son. Harry felt as though he had just been whipped whipped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's large branches. If anyone found out Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, he hadn't thought of that. I noticed in my search of the park that considerable damage seems to have been done to a very valuable whooping tree, Snip went on. The tree did more damage to us than we, Ron blurted out. Silence, snapped Snape again. Most unfortunately, you were not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest on rest with me. I shall go and fetch the people who do have the happy power. You will wait here. Harry and Ron stared at each other. White-faced, Harry didn't feel hungry anymore. He felt extremely sick. He tried not to look at the large, slimy something suspending in a green liquid on the shelf behind Snape's desk. If Snape had gone to fetch Professor McGonagall, head of the Gryffindor's house, they were hardly any better off. She might be she might be fairer than Snape, but she was still extremely strict. 10 minutes later, Snape returned, and sure enough, it was Professor McGonagall who accompanied him. Harry had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but neither he had forgotten just how thin her mouth could go, or he would have never seen her look this angry before. She raised her wand the moment she entered. Harry and Ron both flinched, but she merely pointed it at the empty fireplace where the flames suddenly erupted. Sit, she said, and they both backed into chairs by the fire. Explain, she said, her glasses glittering. Glittering. Ron lunged into the story, starting with the barrier at the station, refusing to let them through. So we had no choice, Professor. We couldn't get on the train. Why didn't you send us a letter by owl? I believe you have an owl, Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. Harry gaped at her. Now she said it. They seemed the obvious thing to have. That should have been the obvious thing to have done. I didn't think that, Professor McGonagall, is obvious. There was a knock on the office door, and Snape, now looking happier than ever, opened it. There stood the headmaster, Professor Dumbledore. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave. He, he stared down his very crooked nose at them, and Harry suddenly found himself wishing he and Ron were still being beaten up by the willow. There was a long silence. Then Dumbledore said, Please explain why you did this. It would have been better if they had shouted. Harry hated the disappointment. It would have been better if he had shouted. Harry hated the disappointment in his voice. For some reason, he was unable to look Dumbledore in the eyes, and spoke instead to his knees. He told Dumbledore everything except that Mr. Weasley owned a bewitched car, making it sound as though he and Ron happened to find a flying car parked outside the station. He knew Dumbledore would see through this at once, but Dumbledore asked no questions about the car. When Harry had finished, he merely continued to peer at them through his spectacles. "We'll go and get our stuff," said Ron in a hopeless sort of voice. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Harry looked quickly at Dumbledore. "Not today, Mr. Weasley," said Dumbledore. "But I must impress upon both of you the seriousness of what you've done. I will be writing to both of your families tonight. I must also warn you that if you do anything like this again, I will have to I will have no choice but to expel you." Snape looked as though Christmas had been cancelled. He cleared his throat and said, "Professor Dumbledore, these boys have flaunted the degree from the restriction of underage wizardry, caused serious damage to the old and valuable tree. Surely acts of this nature, it will be for Professor McGonagall to decide on these boys' punishments, severus," said Dumbledore calmly. "But are they are in her house and are therefore her responsibility." He turned to Professor McGonagall. "I must go back to the feast. Manuel, I've got to give out a few notices. Come, Severus, there's a delicious looking tort I want to sample." Snape shook a look of pure venom at Harry and Ron as he allowed himself to be swept out of his office, leaving them alone with Professor McGonagall, who was still eyeing them like a wrathful eagle. "You better get along to the hospital wing, Wesley. You're bleeding." "Not much," said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eye with his sleeve. "Professor, I want to catch my sister being sorted." "The sorting ceremony is over," said Professor McGonagall. "Your sister is also in Gryffindor." "Oh, good," said Ron. "And speaking of Gryffindor," Professor McGonagall said sharply. But Harry cut in. "Professor, when we took the car, um, term hadn't started, so the Gryffindor shouldn't really have points taken from it, should it?" he finished, watching her anxiously. Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look, but he was sure she almost smiled. Her mouth looked less thin, anyway. "I will not take any points from Gryffindor," she said, and Harry's heart lightened considerably. "But you will both get a detention." It was better than Harry had expected. As for Dumbledore's writing to the Dursleys, that was nothing. Harry knew perfectly well they'd just be disappointed that the whooping willow hadn't smashed him flat. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed it at the Snape's desk. A large plate of sandwiches, 2 silver goblets, and a juice of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. "You will eat in here and then go straight up to your dormitory," she said. "I must also return to the feast." Then the door was closed behind her. Ron let out a long and low whistle. "I thought we had it," he said, grabbing a sandwich. "So did I," said Harry, taking one too. "But you can believe our luck, though," said Ron thickly through a mouthful of chicken and ham. "Fred and George must have flown that car 5 or 6 times, and no muggles had ever seen them." He swallowed and took another huge bite. Why couldn't we get through the barrier?" Harry shrugged. "We'll have to watch our steps from now on, though," he said, taking a grateful swig of the pumpkin juice. Wish we could have gone up to the feast." She didn't want us showing off," said Ron sagely. "Doesn't want people to think it's clever arriving by flying cars. When they had eaten as many sandwiches as they could, the plates kept refilling itself. They rose and left the office, treading the faithful path to the Gryffindor Tower. The castle was quiet. It seemed that the feast was over. They walked past mingling portraits and creaking suits of armor and climbed narrow flights of stone stairs until at last they reached the passage where the secret entrance of the Gryffindor Tower was hidden. Behind an oil painting of a very fat woman in a pink silk dress. Password, she said as they approached. Said Harry. They don't know the new password, but not but having not met a Gryffindor perfect yet, but help could almost immediately. They heard hurrying feet behind them and turned to see Hermione dashing towards them. There you are! Where have you been? The most ridiculous rumors. Somebody said that you were expelled for crashing a flying car. We haven't been expelled, Harry assured her. You're not telling me you did fly here, said Hermione, sounding almost as serious as Professor McGonagall. Skip the lecture, said Ron impatiently, and tell us the new password. It's Watcherbird, said Hermione impatiently, but that's not the point. Her were cut short, however, as the portrait of the fat woman swung open and there was a sudden storm of clapping. It looked as though the whole Gryffindor house was still awake, packed into the circular column room. Standing on the lopsided tables and smushy armchairs, waiting for them to arrive. Arms reached through the porthole wall to pull Harry and Ron inside, leaving Hermione to scramble in after them. Brilliant, yelled Lee Jordan, impressed. What an entrance, flying a car right into the whooping tree. People be talking about that one for years. Good for you, said a fifth year Harry had never spoken to. Someone was patting him on the back as though he had just won a marathon. Fred and George pushed their way to the front of the crowd and said together, "Why couldn't we come in the car?" Ron was scarlet in the face, grinning embarrassedly, but Harry couldn't see one person who didn't look happy at all. But Harry could see one person who didn't look happy at all. Percy was was visible over the heads of some excited first years, and he seemed to be trying to get near enough to start telling them off. Harry nudged Ron in the ribs and nodded in Percy's direction. Ron got the point at once. Uh, Got to get upstairs. A bit tired, he said, and the two of them started pushing their way towards the door on the other side of the room, which led to a spiral staircase and the dormitories. Night, Harry said back over to Hermione, who was wearing a scowl just like Percy's. They managed to get to the other side of the common room, still having their backs slapped, and gained a piece of the staircase. They hurried up it, right on the top, and at last reached the door of their old dormitory, which now had a sign on it saying second years. They entered the familiar circular room with its four-poster beds hung with red velvet, and its high, narrow windows. Their trunks had been brought up for them and stood at the ends of the beds. Ron grinned guiltily at Harry. I know, I shouldn't have enjoyed that or anything but. The dormitory door flew open, and in came the other second year Gryffindor boys, Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom. Unbelievable, beamed Seamus. Cool, said Dean. Amazing, said Neville, awestruck. Harry couldn't help it. He grinned too. That was pretty good, hey? That was hard to read at times, but wow, can you imagine that? Can you imagine flying in a car? I wouldn't have liked landing in the whooping tree though and getting beaten to death by a tree. Um, but they narrowly escaped being expelled, hey? I definitely thought that they would have been. So I want to put in here, I just want to write a quick note that they were very lucky they didn't get expelled. I I'm wondering why they didn't get expelled. I think I would have been expelled if I had done something like that. Is there something that Dumbledore and Mrs. Professor McGonagall knows about Harry, and do they understand a little bit more than what they let on? I don't know. Maybe we'll have to find out.